Well, after a pretty drab and boring Mexican Grand Prix, it seems like that was the pick me up we all needed as F1 fans and F1 watchers. What a race that was. At Interlagos, we've had George Russell winning his first race after having won the sprint race, which Kevin Magnussen, of all people, started on pole from. But that's a different story. We'll get into that in a little bit. Lewis Hamilton finishing second. The Mercedes 1-2. Something we didn't really expect would happen, um, given how the Mercedes car has been off pace this season. And even when it's been relatively on pace, Red Bull and Ferrari, although mostly Red Bull, have usually been better, but isn't the case today. So Mercedes 1-2, and then you've got Sainz behind them, Leclerc, Alonso in fifth, um, and then Verstappen, and then Perez, which is again, I think F1 fans have um, a weird relationship with team orders, but that's something I want to do a later, more in-depth video on in the future, and something again I'll touch briefly upon this in the later in this current video as well. So, again, the race. What didn't happen in that race? So you had a Mercedes leading from the front. Mercedes 1-2, Red Bull 3-4, all got away pretty well, and then Daniel Ricciardo tapping around Kevin Magnussen. Feels bad for Magnussen, by the way. I mean, really tough luck after the high of Friday qualifying on pole. And but that brought out the safety car, and then immediately after the safety car restart, we had Hamilton and Verstappen colliding again, like it was 2021. Verstappen picks up front wing damage. Hamilton gets away relatively unscathed, but falls through the field, has to climb his way back up, which he eventually does. And at that point, Verstappen is relegated to the back, has to fight his way through. And, you know, we had Brazil's always been a great track for racing, just because it seems that it's a track that's catered to overtaking, and I think more importantly, or perhaps just as importantly, it's a track that you cannot one stop at. It's very hard to one stop at. The undercut is so powerful here, and you have to two, if not three, stop it. And we had drivers going off different strategies, teams making making strategies all the time, having to change strategies, and meant that even when there were times during the race when maybe there was a bit of a lull, in a relative lull for Brazil at least, for on-track action, you were always kind of entertained by just the fluctuations of the gaps and what tires they run on, how old is the tire, can they run longer, will they run longer, and etc. So basically, with around 20 laps to go, Russell was leading. Then you had Sainz, who had undercut everyone but was on old mediums. Hamilton, who at that point had pitted and was on relatively fresh softs, similar to Russell. And Perez, who was on relatively fresh mediums. And then Norris's car packs in, and Norris had a pretty interesting race himself. Immediately, not long after the Verstappen Hamilton drama, Norris and Leclerc went side by side essentially up towards the up the hill coming out of the back straight. Norris tags Leclerc. Leclerc spins around, goes nose first into the barrier, is able to continue surprisingly, and yeah, so Norris has had a pretty interesting race up until that point, and Norris's electronics pack in, and he grinds the hope, bringing out the safety car. Now, Sainz takes this opportunity to pit, and this brings back Leclerc, who somehow wasn't out after his collision, and Verstappen into the race. And obviously this brings Hamilton right up to George Russell. Safety car comes in, Hamilton and Russell go at it. The Mercedes has clear pace advantage over the rest of the field. Perez fights Sainz and Leclerc, who Sainz had pitted under the safety car and put on fresh rubber, put on softs, and yeah, Perez was still in the mediums, had no chance. So Perez gets passed by by Sainz, then gets passed by Leclerc, Alonso, who had also pitted on for softs, gets past Perez, and then Verstappen gets past Perez on the understanding, and this is critical here, that if Verstappen cannot get past Alonso by the end of the race, he will give the place back to Perez. That is what Perez has been told over the radio. That is also what Verstappen has been told over the radio as well. Now, we run like this. Hamilton is around 1.1, 1.2 behind Russell. Can't break into DRS. Russell wins his first race. Incredible feeling. Mercedes 1-2, Hamilton finishes second, and then the running order is as what I described at the beginning. And if you remember correctly, Verstappen does not give the place back to Perez. Now, first things first, I think it's right that we talk about, Russell and Mercedes and Hamilton even for that aspect. I mean, it's been a trying season for Mercedes. We know that. Anyone who's watched F1 and followed F1 this season will know that for a team that's been dominant in the last, since 2014 essentially. This has been a very, very poor year. The car, they went the wrong direction of the car. At the beginning of the year, Hamilton wasn't even making out of Q1. They were struggling to make Q3 even. And there were flashes throughout the year, especially towards the back end of the year, where it looks like they were getting on top of it. But then this result, even the Mercedes guys said that we did not expect this pace. And genuinely, this was the only weekend where you could confidently say that the Mercedes was the best car on the grid with no asterisks to it. I mean, Hungary, yes, they qualified on pole, but that was favorable conditions. Then, Mexico, you could have said they had a chance, but Red Bull always had it covered. The US, Hamilton led, but that was more of fortune than anything else, and Verstappen gunned him down in the last couple of laps. But yeah, no, Russell led comfortably. Hamilton carved through the field which is something we haven't seen before this year, at least, because the Mercedes has usually always been mired in traffic. And even with the Mercedes' dragginess, which you could visibly see, because even with DRS, it did struggle to pass the Red Bulls, as we saw in the Saturday sprint with Russell and Verstappen. Even with that straight line deficit, the Mercedes had such a good car that it just didn't matter. They were able to get such good traction. And if you saw the onboards, people who saw the onboards throughout the race, you'd see the Ferrari during the twisty middle section. You'd see the Ferrari and the Red Bull needing 2 or 3 turns to get the nose of the car into the apex, whereas the Mercedes, it seemed like it was just kind of pretty much one fluid motion, which again is something that, what exactly makes this Mercedes tick that is so favorable for the conditions of Brazil. Could it be the cooler temperatures? Could it be mixture of track layout? Again, anytime we think we've got the Mercedes sorted in this season, it's just been like one thing to the next. And even then, in Friday qualifying, they didn't even... Okay, Friday qualifying was a bit mixed because of conditions, but during the dry periods in Friday qualifying, they were nowhere near as fast as they showed today. I personally thought that, they would probably be... They might challenge the Ferraris at best, but just based on qualifying form. But then, in the sprint, they were absolutely flying. And to be fair, I think a lot of people thought, okay, this is interesting. But, Verstappen was on the harder tire and did pick up damage. And I guess a lot of us didn't quite believe that the Mercedes could be this fast, even though, you had all the Red Bull people and all the Ferrari people, the Ferrari drivers, Red Bull drivers just saying, oh, the Mercedes looks unbeatable. I think a lot of us kind of took it with a pinch of salt. I know I did. Because, how many times have we seen the Mercedes look to perform, fairly well in previous races and then just, fall a mile behind Red Bull and Ferrari and bring home, a comfortable 5th, 6th, maybe 4th if, one of the Ferraris fell off, or when one of the Ferraris fell off, such as the Ferrari disaster class it's been this season. But talking about Ferrari, Mercedes are still now, not far behind Ferrari. It's not implausible that if they carry this form to Abu Dhabi, um, they could overtake Ferrari, which I think says, but whatever it says about Ferrari, sorry, whatever it says about Mercedes, it says a lot more about Ferrari in that instance. So it's just, yeah, the fact that we're even talking about them potentially doing this, especially given the contrasting start to seasons they both had, is mental to think about. But yeah, with a bit of luck, hopefully this can be a springboard for Mercedes to go into next season um, with a better car, can challenge Red Bull and Ferrari, and we can have a proper freeway fight, assuming that Ferrari fix their operational flaws, which, to be fair, they reared their ugly head again in in Friday qualifying with Leclerc's tires, and just continual face palms from the F1 community when it comes to Ferrari and their strategy. But yeah, that will be a very interesting finale for Abu Dhabi, and it'll be an interesting thing to go through the off season, thinking about, especially if Mercedes, even if Mercedes even perform well at Abu Dhabi, maybe even just give Ferrari and Red Bull something to think about during the race rather, in Abu Dhabi, then this could get very, very interesting for next season. It's all kind of guess a wait and see in this regard. Now, I did briefly want to touch upon the team order controversies, if you will, back in the race. Again, I do plan on making a longer video about this, and when I get my thoughts in order, because I do these videos kind of without a script, just kind of say what comes to my mind. So I do plan on maybe writing stuff down for that video because I think it is worth talking about. But basically, we had a lot of team order shenanigans in this race. To kick off, we had Ocon and Alonso behind the safety car. Alonso on fresh tires, Ocon on older tires. Ocon told, please do not fight Alonso in no uncertain terms, and Ocon kind of going, I want to get past Vettel, who was ahead at that time, on old mediums, and making no promises. And Ocon's race engineer just going, please do not fight Alonso. Like, this is an order, essentially. And, Ocon did eventually let Alonso go through. So there was no repeat of what happened in Saturday, which again was quite funny considering the fact that the stewards deemed Alonso to be fully at fault for that incident, which I do, to be honest, I do agree with, if you watch the onboard, but that's a different story. And then you had Ferrari as well. Sainz was third, Leclerc was fourth, I think about 3 seconds behind Sainz. Leclerc obviously in that fight for second with Checo, was asking Ferrari to let him pass Sainz. Ferrari essentially said no, and Leclerc, you could hear the sarcasm just go, great, fantastic, essentially something along those lines. And yeah, so that's another incident. But I think the big incident was, again, in the aforementioned second place fight, Verstappen coming back through the field, goes up to Checo, who, remember, at this point is on old mediums. Verstappen's on relatively fresh softs. Checo lets him pass, or rather, even if he didn't let him pass, Verstappen was going to go past anyway, just a tie differential, and Verstappen is a faster driver than Checo. And Checo again was told, if he doesn't pass Alonso, if Verstappen doesn't pass Alonso, he will give back the position. And on the run to the line on the final lap, as he's coming the hill, Verstappen is told, give the position to Checo. Essentially, slow down, give the position to Checo. Verstappen doesn't, crosses the line. GP, his engineer, gets on the radio and goes, what happened? And Verstappen clearly says, you know why I have explained to you the reasons before. Do not ask me to do something like this again. And then for Perez's team radio, you had Christian Horner coming over to apologize, and Perez going, that's the kind of man that he is. Again, one thing I find quite surprising is, especially perhaps for the younger or the newer generation of F1 fans, is the amount of people that are shocked by this Verstappen incident and Verstappen not letting go. Bearing in mind, this is a man who, you know, I think back to, I think it was a 2015 Singapore Grand Prix when Verstappen was told to let Sainz, his then teammate, pass, and Verstappen literally just goes on the radio and goes, no. And his engineer comes back and just says, Max, don't stop being a child, essentially. You know, we've seen like this before. Verstappen has had these incidents before. Verstappen's very tetchy over the radio. And, you know, anyone who's watched F1 during his tenure, for example, myself, knows about this. Which is why I find it kind of surprising that, you know, a lot of the younger or the newer generation perhaps weren't expecting this. And on one hand, I can kind of see why. Verstappen's been hailed at this kind of Hamilton slayer, you know, making things interesting for all intents and purposes. And, you know, it's fair, dominance fatigue is a thing in motorsport. You know, anyone who's been watching F1 longer than I am and can remember the Michael Schumacher days will tell you that as a fact. But what also makes this interesting is that, you know, Verstappen had no reason to fight for this, or no reason to take Perez's P2. Like, he had thrown up the drivers, Red Bull won the constructors, Perez was still in an active fight. Red Bull have never had a 1-2 in the drivers before. So, yeah. But on the other hand, again, do I think it's... On the other hand, you can kind of see why Verstappen doesn't. He's a racing driver, like that's what racing drivers do. And like I said, anyone who's seen Verstappen through his previous summer years and whatnot will understand this. But having said all this, I do think that if you put anyone, like all the F1 drivers and their teammates in their respective position, in Verstappen and Perez's positions, I'm pretty sure like 70 to 80%, if not even more, would do the exact same thing Verstappen did, although maybe not with the words that he used over the radio to justify himself. And again, this goes back to kind of the duality of team orders. Again, just briefly discussing about this. It just seems like F1 fans in particular have a weird relationship with team orders in the sense that we like it when a driver ignores team orders and, you know, ignores team orders to, you know, not fight another driver and whatnot. But we don't like it when an F1 driver ignores team orders to let another driver pass, especially if the other driver is perhaps seen as a bit more likable or like has some previous context behind it. Again, because remember Perez's role in 2021. You know, Perez has always been the second driver to Verstappen. Perez has always moved over whenever Verstappen has requested it, or when Red Bull has requested it. So again, this is very kind of just there's a lot of history to this which I want to explore. You know, I think back to the Malaysian Grand Prix. You know, you've got the Multi 21 with Sebastian Vettel and Mark Webber, and Sebastian Vettel was vilified for it. But then also in that race, you had Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg, where Rosberg begged the radio, essentially, let me pass Lewis. And Mercedes said, no, stay behind him. Rosberg stayed behind him. And I still remember that team radio, and Rosberg said, remember this day. And again, that was kind of overshadowed by the whole Multi 21 incident with Vettel and Webber. But there is a weird duality when it comes to F1 team orders that I do want to explore with when it comes to F1 fans. Other things about this race, just Ferrari continuously shooting themselves in the foot, like I said, in qualifying. Although, to be fair, I don't think that mattered too much in the end with Lando Norris nerfing off Leclerc. Again, the McLarens were just on a madness today. You had obviously Norris nerfing off Leclerc, and then Ricciardo spinning around K-Mag. Like, just poor K-Mag, man. Like, qualifies on pole, drops down the field, which is understandable. Still picks up a point, to be fair. And then just his race ends not even a lap into the actual main event. Which, again, not really how you'd want to... How you want to see it, especially since Kevin Magnussen, you know, was the feel-good story. And again, I would say there's a lot of like interesting narratives moving forward from this race. You know, obviously you've got the whole team dynamic at Red Bull and maybe to a lesser extent Ferrari, because Leclerc was begging Ferrari um, to let him pass Sainz. I would say Alpine as well, but then Alonso and Ocon only have like one race together as teammates, and then Alonso's going to be teammates to Stroll and Aston Martin, who again also races teammates quite hard to say the least. So that'll be fun to see in the future. But yeah, no, fantastic race. Hopefully Abu Dhabi isn't too much of a come down. It's definitely going to be a come down. It always is a come down, but hopefully it isn't too much of a come down. And hopefully all three cars, Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, can actually put on a good show, and end the season off on a high.